They were told Americans would torture them, starve them, and strip them of dignity. But when German prisoners stepped onto Oklahoma farms in 1943, the enemy broke them not with violence, but with hamburgers and Coca-Cola. They expected the end, not survival. When the truck engines finally went quiet in the blistering Oklahoma heat of summer 1943, dozens of German soldiers climbed down onto the dusty farmland, squinting against the fierce sun. Their Wehrmacht uniforms hung loose on their frames, some patched with mismatched cloth or held together with salvaged wire. Hunger carved itself into their faces. Sunken eyes, hollow cheeks, lips split from weeks of insufficient rations and desert combat. Each man had been drilled since basic training with the same message. Americans were barbaric captors, worse than any enemy the Reich had faced. They had been warned that surrender meant torture, starvation, humiliation beyond imagination. Many had steeled themselves to be beaten the moment their boots hit American soil. Instead, what greeted them made them pause. Sprawling wheat fields stretched to the horizon, wooden fences marking property lines, a handful of supervisors with rifles. But the atmosphere was nothing like they had pictured. There was structure here, even a kind of practical order. Trucks moved along dirt roads, and smoke from kitchen chimneys carried the scent of cooking food. Substantial food, far richer than the thin gruel they had survived on for months. Some of the prisoners exchanged cautious glances. Others kept their eyes down, unwilling to show even a flicker of hope. The foreman shouted instructions in English, sharp and direct. The prisoners understood little of it, but the tone was firm, not vicious. Translators relayed orders. Form lines, move forward, maintain discipline. Agricultural agents stood nearby observing, notepads ready. That presence alone startled the prisoners. Back in the Afrika Korps, they had been told America was lawless, corrupt, ruled by gangsters and chaos. Yet here were officials ensuring procedures were followed. Could this be genuine? The processing was methodical but shocking in its basic decency. Men were examined for lice, their filthy uniforms burned, medical evaluations conducted to check for fever, dehydration, infected wounds. A German soldier with a gash on his leg expected to be left to suffer. Instead, an American doctor cleaned the injury, applied sulfa powder, and bandaged it properly. The soldier sat motionless, unable to match the act of care with the image of the brutal enemy hammered into him. Von Prisoner Mutter tu Enaza in German. Warum tun sie das? We are nobody to them. We are the enemy. Enaza replied quietly, Es muss ein Trick sein. Wait and see. The fear persisted. Every step felt like it might reveal the punishment they had been promised. Yet, each hour brought something stranger, an unexpected adherence to the Geneva Convention, that agreement they had heard mentioned but never believed would matter in war. After registration, the men were escorted across the farm property to their new quarters. Dust rose under their boots. The heat pressed through their thin shirts, but the barracks, though simple, were equipped with cots, ventilation, and basic amenities. It was not freedom, not home, but it was shelter. A few prisoners sat cautiously on the bunks, testing them with their weight as though afraid the comfort would dissolve. This was captivity, yes, but inside the men noticed something they could not dismiss. The camp was organized efficiently, but not like a torture chamber. The contrast gnawed at them. All their training had insisted that capture meant degradation, that prisoners became less than human in enemy hands. But here on this Oklahoma farm, the first impressions challenged everything. A supervisor steadying a sick man who stumbled, a medic carefully applying bandages, an agricultural official verifying that water supplies were adequate. The men did not relax, not yet. Suspicion lived in their chests like a constant ache. But as evening came and they lay on real mattresses under worn but clean blankets, they could not help but question whether the greatest shock was not captivity itself, but how captivity looked nothing like the nightmare they had prepared for. For soldiers who had expected brutality, the first day on American farm was the beginning of something they had no language for. But the true shock would not come with rules or sleeping arrangements. It would come on a plate in the mess hall, carried by the smell of grilled meat and the hiss of carbonated bottles waiting to be opened. The next morning, the prisoners woke not to violence or screamed threats, but to a farm bell. The sound jolted many of them awake, not because it was harsh, but because it was ordinary. They had heard similar bells on farms back in Bavaria and Saxony. For a moment, some forgot where they were, but then reality returned with the stomp of boots and the English commands outside. They were ordered into formation, names checked, and directed toward the dining facility. The fear of what might come next sat like a stone in their stomachs. Many expected that food would be withheld as punishment or that they would be given spoiled scraps unfit for livestock. Hunger had been their constant companion in North Africa. Meals had shrunk to bowls of watery soup, sometimes stale bread, and if they were fortunate, a few withered vegetables. Meat was a distant memory, sugar nearly mythical. But before food, there were formalities. The prisoners were gathered in a large room where an agricultural supervisor addressed them through a translator. He explained their status under the Geneva Convention. They would be fed adequately, housed appropriately, and permitted to send letters home under censorship. They would work on the farms, but only under regulated conditions. They would not be mistreated. They would be inspected regularly by neutral officials to ensure compliance with international law. The words were met with skepticism. Some men stared at the floor, ashamed that such things were even being said. Others whispered among themselves, unconvinced. One soldier murmured, "They speak of rules, but we are their prisoners. Why would they follow such rules?" The translator paused to let the murmuring settle. "These are not favors," he said. "These are regulations, binding on both sides." The weight of those words hung in the humid air. After that came more thorough medical examinations. A doctor pressed fingers against bony wrists, examined teeth for scurvy, measured pulse rates. Prisoners were weighed, and many registered dangerously underweight. Some Americans frowned at the numbers. Malnutrition was evident, yet no one mocked them for it. A corpsman even distributed vitamin tablets, small chalky pills that confused the men. Medicine for enemies? It was almost insulting in its unexpected humanity. By the afternoon, they were issued fresh work clothes, plain, durable garments marked with PW in large letters. The clothing fit better than their torn remnants from the desert. Some prisoners changed slowly, hesitating as though each button was a small surrender. Others welcomed the relief, shivering less as the Oklahoma wind cut through the evening air. The supervisors themselves were another puzzle. Yes, they were armed, strict, and vigilant, but they did not curse the prisoners or strike them for moving too slowly. They enforced discipline without cruelty. When one older prisoner tripped on uneven ground, a supervisor reached down and pulled him upright by the arm. No kick, no insult, just a brief nod before moving on. It was deeply disorienting. That night, as the prisoners gathered in their barracks, conversations ran low and tense. "Can we trust them?" one man asked, staring at the wooden ceiling. "They speak of international law as though this is a negotiation." "Do they not despise us?" another replied. "They must be pretending, setting a trap to extract information." And yet, when silence fell, the smell from the kitchens drifted over again. It was thick, savory, fatty, not the sour, thin broths they knew from the desert, but something solid, something filling. Their stomachs betrayed them, growling involuntarily. The Americans, it seemed, did not weaponize food. For them, it was simply routine, a Monday supper, a Wednesday lunch, nothing extraordinary. But for the German prisoners, who had trudged half-dead through sand and rock, who had hidden in foxholes gnawing on hardtack, who had surrendered with bellies hollow and bones visible, that smell was almost unbearable. Some pressed their faces into their pillows to block it out. Others whispered that tomorrow the deception would reveal itself, that the food was bait, that the civility would vanish as quickly as it had appeared. Yet when the next day arrived, the lines formed again and the plates were filled again, and the routine continued, steady and unchanging. The rules were real, the inspections were real, the procedures were real. And the strangest truth of all was slowly pressing itself against their expectations. America, even at war, operated by systems. But the system of rules was nothing compared to what waited in the mess hall itself, where hunger and memory would collide with a hamburger and a glass bottle they had never tasted before. The line moved slowly, boots scraping against the wooden mess hall floor. Steam rose from trays behind the counter, carrying a scent so unfamiliar to German noses that many of the men could not identify it. It was rich, smoky, substantial. Meat, yes, but not like the sausages or small cuts they once ate at home. This was thicker, more generous, something closer to abundance. The prisoners gripped their metal trays like shields, bracing for the humiliation to come. Perhaps rotten food would be slopped onto their plates. Perhaps moldy bread would be tossed at them with contempt. That was what they expected. Hunger made every second feel longer, but fear held them back from appearing too eager. Then the first soldier stepped forward. An American cook, sleeves rolled up to his elbows, placed a thick meat patty onto a soft bun with a spatula, then added fried potatoes on the side. Finally, he reached for a sweating glass bottle, popped the cap with practiced ease, and slid it onto the tray. The red script on the label was foreign, almost artistic. The German soldier stared at the tray as if it were an illusion. His hands shook slightly. "Keep moving," the cook said flatly. The prisoner shuffled forward, still staring. Behind him, others craned their necks to see what had been given. Whispers rippled down the line in German. "Fleisch, they're giving us real meat." When more trays began to fill, disbelief deepened. The bun was soft to the touch, the potatoes fried crisp and golden, and the bottle, Coca-Cola, a supervisor explained curtly, fizzed as though it had captured lightning. In the corner of the hall, the prisoners sat at long wooden tables. They eyed the food warily, almost fearfully, like men who had stumbled into a place they did not belong. A few brought the bottle to their lips. The sweetness hit first, explosive and startling, then the burn of carbonation in their throats. Some gagged, coughing from the shock. Others widened their eyes in amazement. One man laughed, a sudden uncontrolled burst that startled his neighbors. Another covered his face and lowered his head, shoulders trembling, caught between laughter and tears. A thin soldier, ribs visible even under his new work shirt, lifted his hamburger with both hands, as though it might crumble. He sniffed it, then bit in carefully. Grease ran down his chin. He froze mid-chew, as if each bite might disappear if he moved too quickly. Then he lowered his face, hiding the tears that welled up. A comrade nudged him. "Bist du in Ordnung?" The man swallowed hard. "Ich hat Vergessen, the taste of fat." At another table, two prisoners debated quietly in German. "Sie wollen uns schwächen, von Agut." They fatten us, so we lose our will to resist. Or, his companion said slowly, they simply eat like this every day. That idea was harder to swallow than the food itself. The mess hall filled with low sounds, chewing, muffled laughter, an occasional sob quickly suppressed. For a group of men who had lived through the hunger of Tobruk, El Alamein, and the collapsing supply lines of Rommel's retreat, the meal was more than nourishment. It was an assault on everything they believed. One prisoner later whispered to his bunkmate that the sweetness of the Coca-Cola felt like a nightmare turned inside out, too gentle to belong in war. The Americans serving the food noticed nothing unusual. To them, it was standard. They ate the same hamburger and fries, washed it down with the same bottle of Coke, and thought nothing of it. For the supervisors and cooks, feeding prisoners was protocol, but for the prisoners themselves, it was as if they had crossed into another dimension. What shook them most was not the abundance, but the casualness of it all. The Americans were not celebrating, they were not gloating. This was not a feast designed to impress. It was simply Tuesday supper. That contrast hit harder than any insult could have. Here were men who had fought across continents, who had been told that America was weak, decadent, on the verge of internal collapse. Yet in captivity, they were eating better than they had as free soldiers of the Wehrmacht. The shame was sharp, but the relief was sharper still. By the time trays were emptied and bottles stood drained on the tables, the prisoners sat back in silence. Some folded their hands as if in prayer. Others stared blankly at the wall, trying to process what had just occurred. The mess hall supervisors called for order, directing the men back to their barracks. The prisoners filed out, still stunned, still whispering among themselves about what they had tasted. That night, lying on bunks under wool blankets, the memory of the hamburger and Coca-Cola stayed with them. Not just as food, but as evidence. Evidence that their enemy lived in a different reality, one where sweetness could be given to prisoners without thought, one where meat was so plentiful it could be shaped into patties and handed out routinely. But food was only the beginning. Once the rhythms of daily life on the farm took hold, the prisoners would face a new challenge, living with routine, monotony, and moments of humanity that tested everything they thought they knew. The shock of that first meal lingered, but did not erase the reality of captivity. Each morning, the prisoners of war on American farms woke to the sound of roll call, boots crunching on dirt roads, rifles visible in the hands of supervisors positioned around the perimeter. The fences were always there, cutting across the fields, reminding them that this life, no matter how different from what they expected, was still imprisonment. Inside the boundaries, routine governed everything. After breakfast, prisoners were divided into work groups. Some were assigned to harvest wheat, others to repair irrigation ditches, still others to tend livestock under supervised conditions. The work was steady, not punishing. It surprised many of the men that they were not being driven to exhaustion. Instead, they were compensated with small wages in camp scrip, which could be exchanged for items at the farm store: soap, writing paper, even candy or tobacco. One afternoon, a German soldier held up a chocolate bar he had purchased with his coupons. His hands trembled as he unwrapped it. In Germany, he murmured to a fellow prisoner, "This is for special occasions. Here they sell it to us like it is ordinary." His friend shook his head in disbelief. The farm store itself was another revelation. Prisoners watched American workers come and go, chatting easily, buying Coke or chewing gum, joking with the clerk. The casualness of it was almost painful. War was raging across Europe and Africa. Yet here in Oklahoma, Americans seemed to live as though scarcity would never touch them. Still, the daily structure of farm life began to press down in a different way. There was no combat, no advancing lines, no fallen comrades to bury. Instead, there was repetition: wake up, work, eat, sleep. The mind, once consumed by survival, now had space to wander, and with wandering came longing. Letters became lifelines. The farm allowed each prisoner to write 2 letters and 4 postcards per month, heavily censored but still precious. Men hunched over tables, scratching out words with pencils, trying to capture their homes in ink. Ich liebe nach was often all they could manage. Some received letters back, thin envelopes with Gothic script written in familiar hands. Others received none. For those men, silence grew heavier with each passing week. English classes were offered in the evenings. A few curious prisoners attended, repeating words slowly after the American teacher: bread, table, window, family. Others scoffed, insisting there was no use in learning the enemy's language. But even the skeptics listened from their bunks, ears catching the strange rhythm of the words. There were moments of unexpected contact. A supervisor at the worksite once asked a prisoner through the translator, "Do you miss home?" The interpreter relayed the question. The prisoner laughed bitterly and answered in German, "Home is a dream I cannot afford." When the reply was translated, the supervisor grew quiet, perhaps recognizing the weight behind the words. Not all interactions were so gentle. Suspicion lingered. Some supervisors treated the prisoners with coldness, never speaking beyond commands, and within the barracks, arguments broke out among the prisoners themselves. Some clung fiercely to the belief that Germany would triumph, that these months of captivity would end in victory. Others, worn down by what they had seen, muttered that defeat seemed inevitable. One night, 2 men argued so loudly that a supervisor had to intervene. "Du entehrst unser Vaterland when you speak of defeat," one prisoner shouted. "And you dishonor reason by denying reality," the other snapped back. The supervisor silenced them, but the tension remained. Even in the middle of Oklahoma, the war lived inside their minds. Yet, life on the farm also produced small human routines. Prisoners carved wooden objects during free hours, played improvised games with stones and sticks, or simply sat together telling stories of Bavaria, Prussia, the Rhine. The smell of the mess hall never ceased to affect them, but at least it was consistent. 3 meals a day, no matter what. That fact alone set this captivity apart from the desert trenches and crumbling bunkers they had come from. In the barracks at night, silence often fell quickly after lights out, but every so often someone whispered into the dark, "Was this Dane family who'd end?" The answers never came, just sighs and the shifting of blankets. Daily life on the farm was not freedom. It was not cruelty either. It was something in between, a limbo where survival was guaranteed, but meaning felt distant. But the longer they lived within the fences, the more they began to notice something strange. Behind the strict schedules and guarded boundaries, moments of connection began to flicker between captor and captive, moments that could not be explained away by rules or routine. By the summer of 1944, the rhythms of farm life had settled into something the prisoners could not have imagined when they first stepped off the trucks. Hunger no longer carved their faces as sharply. Work, though tiring, did not break their bodies. They wrote letters home, some even daring to ask supervisors how to spell English words. On the surface, life looked manageable. Yet under that surface ran a deep conflict, one that grew sharper as weeks turned to months. How could they reconcile this treatment with the hatred and loyalty they still carried in their hearts? Every night, debates flared in the barracks. Some argued fiercely that this was all manipulation, that America only pretended to treat prisoners well in order to weaken them, to steal their will before the war ended. One man stood up one night, voice harsh, "Do not be deceived. Our Führer demands strength, not comfort. Every hamburger you eat is a small betrayal." Others, weary of suffering, pushed back. "We are alive," one countered. "And if survival is betrayal, then what did dying in the desert accomplish?" Silence followed those words, silence and shame. Letters from home made the contradictions sting even sharper. When a prisoner received word that his family in Hamburg survived on turnips and stale bread, he held the paper in shaking hands while the smell of roast beef drifted from the mess hall. The gulf between his life as a prisoner and theirs as civilians under bombing raids became unbearable. "I eat like a king," he confessed quietly, "while my wife and children starve." It wasn't only food. Safety itself became a symbol. In barracks cooled by fans with steady boots and regular meals, the men remembered family cowering in basements as Allied bombers passed overhead. Captivity offered them security, yet deepened their guilt. Some prisoners clung harder to propaganda, repeating it like mantras. America was decadent, hollow, ready to collapse from within. But the evidence around them mocked those words. On the farm, Coca-Cola bottles arrived by the crate. Cigarettes were available not just for workers, but for prisoners. Work crews saw American farmers with tractors